A marriage in Tudor England could collapse without a single mistake, only a whisper repeated enough times. The court never needed proof to rewrite a woman's fate. Only the right silence in the right corridor. As doubt spread, reputations shifted long before anyone realized what had changed. Suspicion traveled faster than truth, and no one was safe from its shadow. Tonight, you will walk beside the woman whose entire life unraveled because others chose to listen. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand inside a Tudor palace and listen carefully, the first thing noticed would not be the rustling of gowns or the clatter of servants' shoes, but the quiet drift of unclaimed words moving through the halls. The court functioned less like a seat of government and more like a dense network of eyes, each pair watching the others for any sign of weakness. People lived close enough to measure one another's breaths, yet far enough to hide what they truly intended. In such a place, reputation was not merely a personal concern, but a form of currency, and women bore the highest cost. A wife's loyalty and virtue were treated as public property, constantly judged, constantly compared, and constantly questioned by those who stood to gain from her decline. Anyone who observed long enough would notice that the boundaries between truth and rumor were thin and frequently crossed. A whispered remark could travel from a dim corridor to the great hall before midday, shedding and gaining new meanings with every retelling. No one needed to speak openly. Suggestion alone carried weight. A lowered voice, a careful pause, or an unfinished sentence could move faster than any royal announcement, shaping how the court saw the women who were expected to embody stability in a society where honor was fragile and suspicion was always available. Silence itself could become evidence. The palace operated on endless observation. Servants watched their masters, ladies watched one another, and men watched every woman whose virtue could influence alliances or property. Every gesture was interpreted. Every absence was noticed. The architecture of the court, with its narrow passages and echoing stone, amplified the movement of people while obscuring the origin of their words. It was a place where nothing appeared private, yet everything could be hidden behind the simplest phrase. The expectations placed on women created an environment where judgment was immediate and rarely questioned. A wife was required to embody patience, purity, and unwavering loyalty, even when her life offered little protection. The scrutiny was constant, and the consequences of suspicion were severe, because honor was tied to lineage, property, and social standing. Even the faintest hint of impropriety could shift how a family was viewed. For many women, their futures depended on how quietly others spoke about them, and how loudly those whispers multiplied. In this setting, rumor became a tool with no owner. It demanded no evidence, no witnesses, and no accountability. The court accepted it as part of its daily rhythm, as ordinary as the ringing of the chapel bell. Once released, a whisper moved independently of the person who started it. It adjusted to the expectations of the listener, gaining credibility not because it was true, but because it was repeated. The court did not require proof. It required only something to speak about. And women's reputations provided endless material. Even those untouched by scandal understood how quickly circumstances could change. They watched how a single comment could shift public perception overnight. They saw how the smallest story, once carried through the servants' quarters and into the council chamber, could transform a respected wife into a subject of uneasy glances. This instability created a constant pressure, a quiet sense that danger lived not in actions, but in interpretations. Women were judged not by what they did, but by what others believed they had done. Nothing in the Tudor court was as influential as a whisper, It could strengthen a man's alliances or undermine them. It could elevate one woman's standing while destroying another's without leaving any trace of its creator. Because it travelled silently, it was often dismissed as harmless. Yet its consequences were enduring. Those who understood the power of rumour learned to listen carefully, to measure each word, and to fear what might spread when they were not present. In an environment defined by scrutiny and rivalry, rumour did not need to be malicious to be destructive. It only needed to exist. And in the Tudor court, it always existed. It moved in the shadows between conversations, attaching itself to the ambitions of those who understood its value. Women who lived within this system had little control over how they were discussed. Yet their lives were shaped by the sound of voices they could not identify. Rumour was not an interruption to court life. It was the fabric that held it together. The palace walls preserved secrets but also amplified speculation. Every corridor had seen alliances shift, reputations overturn, and loyalties vanish, all beginning with a few carefully placed words. The court relied on this quiet exchange, even when pretending to condemn it. Its members were sustained by information, real or imagined, and the appetite for such information never diminished. The court's fragile order rested on the rumours that moved beneath it. The atmosphere around these exchanges began to darken in small, nearly invisible ways. And somewhere inside that gathering haze, the first whisper aimed at a wife was already preparing to settle into the cracks of her life. A mistress in the Tudor court lived in a position that appeared enviable from afar, but dissolved into uncertainty the moment one stepped closer. She held no legal recognition, no title protected by church or crown, and no standing that could shield her from the shifting moods of the man whose attention defined her existence. Her place was granted through favour, not right. And favour in the Tudor world was a resource that moved unpredictably. She occupied rooms that were never truly hers, and walked corridors where every glance reminded her how quickly someone like her could be replaced. Dependence shaped every aspect of her daily life. The powerful man who kept her close could also cast her aside without explanation. And she understood that his interest was the only barrier between her and irrelevance. His household, advisors, relatives, and rivals all carried unspoken opinions about her presence, and each of them could influence the atmosphere around her. She learned to measure his tone, observe his silences, and anticipate his concerns, because her comfort, her reputation, and sometimes even her safety depended on catching the smallest signs of change before they hardened into decisions. This vulnerability forced her into a constant state of calculation. She had no authority to issue commands or negotiate alliances openly. Yet she needed to secure her place in a world that offered her nothing permanent. Strategy became her form of self-preservation. She observed how others moved through court, how they spoke, what they avoided, and where they collected information. She paid attention to servants who carried trays through private chambers, to ladies who lingered in doorways, and to men who watched her with polite restraint. Every detail could be a warning or an opportunity, and she absorbed them all because she had no margin for error. Her behaviour required precision. She had to appear grateful without seeming desperate, confident without appearing bold, and valuable without threatening the established order. Any misjudgment could be interpreted as ambition beyond her station, and ambition from someone without legal standing invited quiet retaliation. She was expected to offer comfort to a powerful man, yet remain invisible to the structures that surrounded him. She had to move with ease while knowing that every gesture and every expression might be repeated elsewhere with new implications. Even moments of apparent privilege carried their own risks. A seat too close to the fire, a compliment spoken in public, or a private visit at the wrong hour could fuel speculation among those eager to reshape her image. She had no control over how others described her, and she understood that reputation, fragile even for noble women, was nearly impossible to protect for someone with no formal rank. The wrong remark from a single observer could attach itself to her name, spreading quietly through the palace until it became accepted as truth. Because she lacked the protections of title and lineage, she relied on subtle, unseen strategies to defend herself. She learned to deflect attention without appearing evasive. She learned to charm without promising too much. She learned to appear harmless while monitoring the behavior of everyone around her. These skills were not luxuries, they were necessities. Without them, she risked becoming vulnerable to those who viewed her as an obstacle, a temporary amusement, or a danger to established households. Her understanding of the court ran deep precisely because she could never afford to misunderstand it. She recognized that each interaction carried a weight she could not ignore. Every conversation might reveal shifting alliances. Every silence might signal disapproval. She lived in a state of heightened awareness, not because she wished to manipulate others, but because she knew she was always being observed and evaluated by people who owed her nothing. In this environment, survival required a kind of intelligence the court never acknowledged openly. A mistress needed to understand power without possessing it, anticipate danger without naming it, and navigate hostility without reacting to it. She relied not on authority, but on perception, using the smallest gestures to maintain a place that could vanish in an instant. Her life was shaped by forces she could not control, yet she worked tirelessly to remain relevant within them. Her existence was a contradiction the court preferred not to examine closely. She was both central and peripheral, visible and disposable. Each day demanded careful negotiation, and each night carried uncertainty about what the next morning would bring. Her presence depended not on right, but on usefulness. And usefulness in the Tudor court could evaporate with a single change in opinion. Her entire world rested on a foundation that could shift at any moment. The tension around her position deepened in ways that were easy to overlook yet impossible to ignore. And in that gathering unease, the first quiet comparisons between her and a wife began to take on a different tone. A lawful wife in the Tudor court occupied a position defined not by affection but by structure. Her standing was rooted in recognition from the church and the crown, giving her a legitimacy no mistress could approach. The institution of marriage placed her at the center of inheritance, lineage, and continuity, and these responsibilities shaped every part of her life. She lived under a framework that granted her authority, while also subjecting her to a scrutiny that never relented. Her identity was tied to the stability of the household, and the household, in turn, depended on the perception of her virtue. The law acknowledged her in ways that protected her future. Property, titles, and family alliances flowed through her, making her an essential figure in maintaining the social order. Children born to her were guaranteed their place in the lineage, strengthening her influence within the home and the broader network of relatives whose fortunes rose and fell together. Her presence ensured continuity, and even those who disliked her position understood that removing her would destabilize the very structure they relied upon. Yet this recognition carried a weight that could not be put down. Every action she took reflected not only on herself, but on the family name she represented. Her dignity, her composure, and her behavior were constantly measured, both indoors and at court. A fault displayed in public could be interpreted as a failure of the entire household. The expectations placed upon her were precise and unforgiving, leaving little room for missteps and no room for the interpretation of her actions beyond their surface. Her authority within the household was real but bounded. She oversaw the management of servants, ensured the upbringing of children, and maintained the daily routines that kept the estate functioning. Her decisions influenced the well-being of everyone under her care. Yet she was expected to exercise this influence with restraint. The court admired wives who were orderly, discreet, and predictable, valuing them as symbols of stability rather than as individuals with ambitions of their own. This role, formal and respected, also carried limitations that often went unspoken. The same legal structures that acknowledged her importance confined her movements and narrowed her choices. A wife was expected to embody patience and virtue, even when confronted with circumstances that challenged her dignity. Her marriage was not a personal contract, but a public one, and she bore the consequences of its difficulties more visibly than her husband. Her value was measured not only by her conduct, but by how convincingly she upheld the image of a harmonious household. Despite these pressures, she held advantages that others at court could not ignore. Her position gave her access to resources, alliances, and institutional support. She could rely on the backing of relatives, the protection of marriage law, and the expectation that her role would be preserved even through conflicts. Her presence offered continuity, and the court favored continuity over disruption. Those who threatened her standing faced a complex structure of loyalties and obligations that made replacing her neither simple nor convenient. Still, stability did not equal safety. Even with the law on her side, a wife could not escape the constant observation that defined court life. People judged her silence, her posture, her expressions, and her interactions. They watched how she managed her children, how she spoke to servants, and how she responded to her husband in public. Every detail had the potential to shape or distort her reputation. And once damaged, her reputation was difficult to restore. Her role as the embodiment of order made her particularly vulnerable to rumor. The more essential she was to the stability of the household, the more disruptive it became when whispers began to surround her name. Questions about her virtue or loyalty reached deeper than those directed at others, because the consequences extended beyond personal disgrace. A single suggestion that she failed in her duties as a wife or mother could undermine the legitimacy of her children and threaten her family's standing. The court saw her as a fixed point around which others moved, but even fixed points could be eroded over time. She carried responsibilities that demanded perfection while receiving little room for error. The world expected her to remain composed regardless of circumstance, and any sign of distress or hesitation might be interpreted as a failing. Her life was shaped by expectations she did not choose, yet she was held accountable for meeting them flawlessly. Her stability rested on structures that looked solid until examined closely. The pressure surrounding her role gathered quietly, settling into places where certainty once lived. Only when the silence inside those corridors began to shift did the first faint disturbance touch the edges of her life. Whispers in the Tudor court rarely arrived with intention. They slipped into the corridors as faint disturbances, thin enough to be ignored, yet persistent enough to alter the way people carried themselves. Nothing about them was clear. No distinct phrase, no repeated detail, no identifiable source. They were simply present, drifting along the cold stone walls at a pace slow enough to seem harmless. Those who caught fragments of them did not pause to ask what had been said. Instead, they reacted to the shift in atmosphere, the slight tightening of expression that came when uncertainty touched a familiar name. This uncertainty moved through the palace without direction, settling briefly before continuing onward. The nature of the Tudor court made such moments unavoidable. People lived in proximity, sharing halls and chambers where conversations overlapped and observations multiplied. It took very little for suspicion to form. Someone hesitated before returning a greeting. Someone else altered their usual route through the gallery. And collectively, these adjustments created the sense that something had changed, even before anyone could articulate what that change might be. The court had experienced this pattern many times, and its inhabitants recognized it immediately. A whisper had begun to circulate, though no one could repeat it with confidence. The wife who found herself near the center of this shift noticed nothing at first. Her daily tasks continued without interruption. She spoke to attendants with her usual composure, reviewed the household accounts, and maintained the orderly routine expected of her position. Nothing in her outward behavior suggested a reason for comment. Yet the people around her had begun to reinterpret her actions with a subtle but unmistakable tension. A lowered gaze, once dismissed as modesty, now appeared guarded. A moment of silence, once overlooked, now carries potential meaning. Her consistency no longer protected her. It merely provided more material for whispered interpretation. The servants felt the shift before anyone else. They moved through every room, witnessed every gesture, and carried news between the highest and lowest spaces. Their awareness did not come from malicious intent, but from habit. In a palace, where hierarchy depended on perception, they learned to notice changes long before those changes reached formal conversation. When a whisper passed through their quarters, it travelled not as a statement, but as an absence. Something unspoken that influenced the way hands paused over tasks, or how voices lowered when a name was mentioned. They became the first to adjust, though they rarely understood the content of the rumour itself. Within the court, rumour did not require clarity to gain influence. It required only repetition. Each time someone hesitated before speaking, the whisper gained strength. Each time someone glanced away rather than risk eye contact, it gathered momentum. The absence of detail made the rumour more malleable, allowing listeners to shape it according to their expectations or private doubts. Because no one had heard it distinctly, no one felt responsible for denying it. That responsibility dissolved into the collective silence of people who preferred caution over certainty. The wife eventually sensed the change, not through words, but through behaviour. The warmth she once received from distant relatives cooled. Conversations shortened. The rhythm of the household shifted in ways too small to point out, but too consistent to ignore. She understood that something had begun to reshape her surroundings, though she could not trace its outline. Any attempt to address it directly risked appearing defensive, and appearing defensive risked confirming concerns she did not yet know existed. The danger lay not in accusation but in ambiguity. This ambiguity created the perfect environment for perception to replace reality. People observed her with new attentiveness, searching for signs of a fault they had not defined. Her posture, her tone, even the way she folded her hands, could suggest contradiction if examined long enough. A whisper with no content allowed the court to imagine its own version of events, each version shaped by the person repeating it. The rumour spread not through speech but through interpretation, quietly embedding itself in the routines of the palace. As time passed, the uncertainty became self-sustaining. No one needed to claim they had heard anything clearly. No one needed to express belief or disbelief. The collective act of watching her differently was enough to change the meaning of her presence. Without realizing it, the court transformed her into a subject of speculation. And speculation in the Tudor world rarely faded without consequence. The whisper continued to move, leaving behind a trail of altered glances and unspoken doubts. The power of such a moment did not come from intent but from atmosphere. A whisper with no edges could slip into conversations unnoticed, reshape loyalties, and create distance where none existed before. It turned ordinary behaviours into possible evidence and ordinary silence into something suspicious. Even those who respected her role felt themselves adjusting unconsciously, as though waiting for confirmation that never arrived. The first vague shift in the corridor changed the court's posture long before anyone admitted it. People responded to the unease without understanding its source, allowing the tension to deepen around her name. By the time the atmosphere settled, the faint suggestion that she was not as secure as she appeared had already begun to take hold. Subtlety was the preferred method in a court where accusations carried consequences not only for the accused, but also for the accuser. Those who wished to alter a reputation understood that a direct claim would provoke defense, witnesses, and scrutiny, a seed of doubt. However, required none of these things. It could be placed quietly, almost gently, in the mind of a listener who did not realize they were being guided. The most effective strategy did not involve identifying wrongdoing, but suggesting that something might exist, waiting to be noticed. This suggestion moved easily through a world already trained to search for hidden meanings. The process began with a tone rather than a statement, a lowered voice, a pause too deliberate to be accidental, or a sigh that carried weight without context. These gestures communicated more than explicit accusations could. They drew listeners closer, inviting them to fill the silence with their own interpretations. No one felt pressured to believe anything specific. Instead, they were encouraged to wonder. Wondering was safer, more private, and far less traceable than belief. It allowed a rumour to gather momentum without carrying the burden of proof. The one spreading doubt rarely mentioned the wife directly. Instead, they referred to patterns, moods, or impressions. They might observe that she seemed distracted lately, or that her schedule had changed in quiet ways. They might ask whether anyone else had noticed a shift in her manner. These questions had no accusation embedded within them. Yet listeners instinctively searched their memories for confirmation. Once they found even a single detail that aligned with the suggestion, the seed took root. What had been a coincidence now appeared meaningful. Listeners often completed the work themselves. In the Tudor court, people were accustomed to interpreting fragments, and they believed that their own conclusions carried more credibility than any prepared speech. The one who introduced the doubt understood this well and trusted that human instinct would do the rest. When someone revisited their conversations from earlier in the week, or recalled an expression they had not thought important at the time, the rumour grew stronger without requiring additional influence. This method worked particularly well because it bypassed confrontation. The wife had nothing specific to deny and nothing concrete to address. Any attempt to counter these vague impressions risked appearing defensive or overly concerned. Silence could be interpreted as acceptance, but a response could be interpreted as guilt. This left her in a position with no safe direction. Her reputation shaped by conversations she could neither hear nor influence. Even those who initially dismissed the subtle remarks found themselves revisiting them later, often at moments when the wife was absent. It was easier to question someone who was not present, to contradict those questions. The absence created space for speculation. Listeners compared their impressions, reinforcing one another unintentionally. A pause in one conversation might match a hesitation in another, and together these unrelated moments developed a false coherence. The whisper gained structure not because it was shaped deliberately, but because people wanted their observations to make sense. The court's atmosphere encouraged this process. Its inhabitants were trained to read between lines, to assume hidden motives, and to expect manipulation in every corner. A vague suggestion fit naturally within this environment. It felt familiar, plausible, and safe to repeat. Even those who believed themselves careful with information often passed along a softened version of the initial remark, thinking they were merely sharing a general concern. In doing so, they strengthened a narrative without realizing they had participated in its creation. What made this technique particularly effective was its ability to adapt. Unlike a direct accusation, which could be disproven, a hint of doubt could evolve. It adjusted to new details, incorporated unrelated observations, and expanded as it traveled. Each retelling added a layer, and eventually, the story no longer resembled the initial suggestion. Yet no one could identify where the transformation had occurred. The lack of clarity protected everyone involved, except the woman at the center of it. By the time the wife sensed that something had shifted in how people viewed her, the process had already matured. She faced not a single claim, but a collection of half-formed assumptions, none of which she could fully confront. People watched her with a distance she could not explain. Their behavior suggested that they believed something about her had changed, though they rarely understood what they believed themselves. The doubt had become self-sustaining, no longer tied to the person who planted it. The method required minimal effort but produced lasting effects. It allowed the instigator to remain innocent in appearance, untouched by the consequences of their influence. They had merely asked questions, as anyone might. The damage came from how others answered those questions silently, reshaping a woman's reputation through interpretations she would never be allowed to witness. A few uncertain words were enough to shift how the court viewed her ordinary actions. The atmosphere around her settled into a cautious stillness that felt heavier with each passing day. Somewhere within that silence, listeners began looking for signs that could confirm the doubts they had unknowingly accepted. Court life relied as much on what was unspoken as on what was declared. And nowhere was this more visible than in the Great Hall. It was a space designed for ceremony, yet it functioned equally as a stage for subtle exchanges. People moved through it with practiced grace, offering greetings and courtesies that appeared effortless. But beneath those gestures lay a constant evaluation of one another. A single glance that lasted a fraction longer than expected could redirect a conversation. A smile that did not fully form could introduce a question no one intended to answer aloud. The room, filled with polished surfaces and attentive watchers, amplified these moments until they became part of the court's ongoing narrative. Short, deliberate exchanges of eye contact held particular weight. They allowed individuals to communicate without aligning themselves with spoken allegations. A fleeting glance toward the wife, followed immediately by a glance toward someone else, suggested a shared understanding, even when none existed. Those observing these exchanges rarely considered their origins. They simply registered them as indicators of shifting sentiment. Over time, these small signals accumulated, creating the impression that multiple people held the same suspicion. The result was a quiet reinforcement of whatever doubts were already circulating, even if no one could articulate what those doubts actually were. Half smiles carried a different kind of implication. They were controlled, subtle, and intentionally incomplete. When directed towards someone in the midst of whispered speculation, such a smile could suggest amusement, disbelief, or superiority. The ambiguity was the entire point. Listeners nearby who noticed the gesture might interpret it according to their own expectations, believing they had witnessed evidence of shared knowledge. These smiles did not accuse, they invited interpretation. They shaped the emotional tone of a conversation without altering its stated content. People walked away from such moments convinced they had understood something, though they could not name what it was. Silence, when used at the right moment, became an even more powerful tool. In the Great Hall, conversation flowed easily, but strategic pauses introduced tension where none had existed before. A person might begin to speak about the wife, hesitate, and then change direction, as though reconsidering their words. The hesitation alone was enough to imply that the original comment carried weight. Others who witnessed the shift were encouraged to imagine what had gone unsaid. Silence provided a space that observers filled with their own assumptions, and these assumptions often aligned with the doubts that had already begun to shape the court's perception of her. The wife, moving through the hall with her usual composure, sensed the difference without understanding its cause. She saw glances exchanged just as she approached. She noticed smiles that faded the moment she entered a conversation, and felt the quiet around her stretch slightly longer than politeness required. Nothing was said openly, yet the atmosphere carried an unmistakable change. People who once greeted her with steady warmth now offered greetings softened by restraint. None of these gestures was hostile, but each one carried a suggestion that she had become an object of discussion rather than a participant in it. Those who initiated these gestures rarely intended to create direct accusations. They relied on the court's natural tendency to search for meaning in everything it observed. A glance did not accuse. It merely encouraged the viewer to decide what the glance implied. A half smile did not confirm wrongdoing. It simply suggested that wrongdoing might be known. A pause in conversation did not name the wife. It only offered enough silence for her name to appear in someone's mind. These methods allowed doubt to spread without anyone risking the consequences of openly challenging her reputation. As days passed, these subtle exchanges formed a pattern. Observers adjusted their behavior around her, not because of something they had heard clearly, but because of what they thought others had understood. The Great Hall, with its echoing walls and constant movement, became the perfect environment for uncertainty to grow. People repeated their own interpretations through gestures rather than words, reinforcing the atmosphere without ever acknowledging it directly. The wife stood at the center of this shifting arrangement, increasingly aware that her presence altered the behavior of those around her, yet unable to locate the point where their perception had begun to change. Such gestures were not dramatic, but their cumulative effect reshaped the court's expectations. They created the sense that an unspoken truth lingered beneath everyday interactions. Each glance, each restrained smile, each calculated silence became part of a quiet sequence that signaled to others that they should pay closer attention to the wife's behavior. Without realizing it, the court had begun watching her in a new way, searching for indications that aligned with a story they had not yet heard but already believed possible. Small gestures in the hall had done enough to alter how people observed her. Even without a single spoken claim, the atmosphere turned heavier, filled with conclusions built from fragments of behavior rather than substance. By the time the room settled into its new quiet, people had already begun waiting for a sign that might confirm what they preferred to imagine. Servants moved through the Tudor court with a freedom that no noble could match. They entered rooms unnoticed, carried garments and messages without question, and observed moments their superiors assumed would remain private. Their constant movement turned them into bridges between spaces that were otherwise separated by rank. Anyone seeking to influence the flow of information understood that the most effective route was not through official channels, but through the quiet pathways servants followed every day. What passed through their hands also passed through their conversations, often reshaped, before reaching its final destination. The process began with something small. An offhand remark delivered in a dressing chamber, while a servant adjusted a sleeve or fastened a clasp. The comment did not need direction or detail, it only needed to sound reflective, as though spoken without intention. A simple observation about the wife seeming tired, distracted, or unusually withdrawn was enough. Servants were not asked to repeat the remark. They repeated it because repetition was a natural result of witnessing the lives of those above them. The comment became a point of curiosity, a detail to be shared while preparing garments or sweeping floors, spreading quietly through the spaces where nobles rarely set foot. Expressions of concern proved even more effective. A mistress who approached a servant with carefully crafted worry, nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, could shape the servant's perception without appearing manipulative. She might ask whether the wife seemed unwell, or mention that she hoped nothing troubling was affecting the household. These questions positioned her as thoughtful and considerate, not critical. Servants responded to such displays with instinctive sympathy, unaware that their reactions contributed to a narrative being built around someone who had never asked for attention. When they repeated these concerns later, they added their own interpretations, giving the rumor a layer of sincerity it had not possessed initially. Once speculation reached the kitchen, its momentum increased. Kitchens were the center of the household's informal communication. Servants gathered there between tasks, sharing observations from their assigned areas. A whisper from a dressing chamber, once repeated by a kitchen maid, gained a weight that seemed grounded in collective experience. The story changed shape with each retelling. Someone remembered a moment when the wife hesitated before speaking. Someone else recalled her walking alone in a corridor. These details, insignificant on their own, merged into something larger simply because they were assembled in the same room. From the kitchen, the rumor traveled to the hallways and sleeping quarters. Nighttime conversations between chambermaids, stable boys, and footmen allowed the speculation to settle into the rhythm of the household. People repeated what they believed they had heard, unaware of the transformations occurring as the rumor passed from one group to another. A single suggestion, made in a tone of casual concern, became, within a few days, a pattern of behavior that others believed they had noticed themselves. The wife's reputation shifted quietly even as she maintained her routines. unaware that servants were increasingly viewing her through a lens shaped by someone else's intentions. Servants rarely intended harm. They acted according to human nature, interpreting comments through personal experience and passing along stories that seemed relevant or interesting. Their conversations were shaped by proximity rather than loyalty. And proximity made them valuable instruments in spreading ideas that did not need confirmation to be accepted. In a court environment where information carried as much power as rank, their words travelled further than those spoken in council chambers. The effect of their circulation became visible in subtle changes throughout the household. Servants approached the wife with measured politeness, avoiding the familiarity they once displayed. They hesitated before entering her rooms, unsure whether their presence might be interpreted differently now. Their behaviour, altered only slightly, suggested that something had shifted in the household's perception of her. These shifts reinforced the doubts already present among the nobles who observed the servants' reactions closely, interpreting them as evidence of something unspoken. Meanwhile, the one who had initiated the chain of suggestion remained untouched by the consequences. She spoke only once, in a room where she appeared relaxed and unconcerned. She never repeated her remarks, never encouraged others to spread them, and never behaved as though she had influenced anything at all. Her calculated distance protected her from scrutiny. She allowed the household to do the work for her, trusting that servants, through their natural conversations, would carry the rumour to every corner of the estate. By the time the wife sensed the shift in the servant's demeanour, the pattern was beyond her reach. What had begun as a single remark had become a collective understanding, shaped by countless small conversations. She could not address the servants directly without appearing defensive, and she could not correct a story that no one openly acknowledged. The household now viewed her through a filter she could not remove. A single suggestion had travelled through the household with alarming ease. The changed behaviour of those around her created a quiet pressure she could neither identify nor confront. Once the shift took hold within the servants' routines, they began searching for signs that seemed to align with the story they believed they had uncovered themselves. Servants occupied the lowest tiers of the Tudor household, yet they held access to spaces that no noble would have dared enter uninvited. Their presence was constant but quiet, unnoticed by those who believed themselves the centre of attention. They heard conversations not meant for them, observed expressions that slipped when doors were half closed, and gathered impressions from daily routines that nobles considered too mundane to monitor. This vantage point did not give them authority, but it granted them something more potent within the court's hidden structures: the ability to carry information without appearing responsible for it. Their knowledge moved freely, because no one imagined they could shape the perception of an entire household. Their silence made them effective carriers. Servants rarely spoke openly about what they heard, yet they stored fragments unconsciously, allowing those fragments to resurface in later conversations. A remark made in exhaustion, a sigh exchanged between two nobles, or a fleeting look inside the great hall. Each detail entered the servant's memory in a form untouched by intention. Their understanding of events was incomplete, but a lack of context did not make their observations harmless. When doubt had already taken root, even the smallest detail felt important enough to repeat, often in rooms where the original speaker would never be present. Once, a seed of suspicion reached the servants' quarters. It expanded quickly. A maid folding linens might recall the wife pausing longer than usual before answering a question. A footman polishing silver might mention seeing her leave a gallery at a time that felt unusual. No single detail carried meaning by itself, yet each retelling added weight. Servants who had not witnessed anything themselves began to contribute imagined confirmations, believing they were recognizing patterns rather than creating them. Doubt, once scattered, began to thicken into something resembling collective belief. The spaces where these conversations unfolded shaped their force. In the kitchen, where noise and heat made people speak freely, a simple guess could transform into a shared conclusion within minutes. In narrow corridors, where servants passed one another quickly, Hurried remarks gained urgency. In sleeping quarters, where exhaustion loosened restraint, speculative comments hardened into confident statements. Because servants moved through every level of the household, these shifts in perception did not remain isolated. They migrated upward, disguised as casual updates about the general atmosphere, until nobles began to sense a change without knowing its origin. As the rumour travelled, it grew less like a story and more like a lens. Servants who believed the wife might be hiding something adjusted their interpretation of her behaviour. When she offered a polite instruction, they sensed tension. When she appeared thoughtful, they saw distraction. When she walked alone, they imagined secrecy. These reactions fed back into the household through countless small gestures, stiffened postures, shortened responses, and avoided eye contact, which nobles recognized as signs of unease. The wife, observing the shift without understanding it, and found herself increasingly isolated in her own home. Inside the family, the consequences emerged gradually. Her husband noticed servants hesitating before speaking to her. Relatives observed how staff exchanged glances when her name was mentioned. Even children sensed the subtle withdrawal in the household, responding with questions she could not answer. None of these reactions accused her directly, yet each one suggested that something had changed. A family's stability depended on unity of perception, and unity was impossible once doubt entered through the hands of those entrusted with its daily functioning. No one intended to harm her. The servants were responding to the environment shaped around them, unaware that their interpretations carried weight beyond their station. They repeated what they believed was true because repetition felt natural. Their thoughts, once spoken aloud, began to reshape the narrative of the household without requiring malice. In a court where clarity was rare and speculation was plentiful, even unintentional distortions held the power to shift loyalties. The danger lay in how easily a rumor could grow without direction. A single remark picked up by a servant could become a household certainty within days. Once established, the idea did not require further prompting. It circulated through the building with the steady rhythm of footsteps on stone floors, altering relationships with each pass. A family that had once moved as a coherent unit began to show cracks, not because of any verified wrongdoing, but because the invisible carriers of daily life had unknowingly aligned themselves with a version of events shaped by doubt. In this environment, the wife's actions mattered less than the interpretations surrounding them. Her attempts to maintain composure were seen as restraint. Her efforts to appear calm were viewed as concealment. Every neutral gesture became a potential confirmation of suspicions she had not heard. The household, influenced by the mechanisms of rumor passing through unseen hands, began to shift away from her without speaking a word. Invisible messengers had reshaped the household long before anyone realized what had been set in motion. Their quiet exchanges deepened the tension that had begun forming around her life. As the new atmosphere settled over the family, the earliest fractures in its unity became impossible to ignore. Doubt gained its sharpest edge when directed at a woman's virtue. For the Tudor court treated a wife's moral standing not as her own possession, but as the foundation of her entire household. Those who wished to weaken her position understood that they did not need evidence. They needed only to reshape how others interpreted her movements. The earliest questions appeared gentle, almost sympathetic, as if raised out of concern rather than suspicion. Someone wondered whether she had seemed distracted lately. Someone else recalled that she had walked alone more often than usual. These remarks, small and uncertain, carried an implication that listeners absorbed before realizing what they had accepted. Suggestions about her fidelity emerged gradually. They were rarely spoken to directly, for a direct accusation risked backlash. Instead, people asked whether her husband had been away more frequently or whether she had seemed restless during recent gatherings. These questions implied that her loyalties might be shifting without stating that they had. The very act of raising the possibility forced listeners to consider it, even if they rejected it at first. Doubt required no confirmation. It required only repetition. Each time the topic surfaced, it gained texture, shape, and weight. Hints about private meetings proved especially effective. No one needed to claim they had seen anything. It was enough to mention that she had passed through a certain hallway at an unusual hour, or that she had spoken quietly with someone in a shadowed corner of the garden. These moments, ordinary in isolation, became suspicious once framed as part of a pattern. People reconstructed their memories according to the suggestion, remembering details that had seemed irrelevant at the time. A gesture, a tone, or a delay in responding could be reshaped into something significant. Her absence, once overlooked, became central to the rumour's growth. If she failed to appear at a gathering, people wondered where she had been. If she arrived late to a scheduled task, they questioned what had detained her. Even when she followed her usual routines, others reinterpreted them through the lens of suspicion. A morning spent in prayer became a possible excuse. An afternoon supervising the household became an opportunity for secrecy. Her actions did not change, but the meaning assigned to them did. The mechanisms of rumour worked efficiently because they relied on observation rather than fabrication. The court noticed her movements simply because they had been told to. Her face, once seen as composed, now suggested hidden emotion. Her pauses appeared weighted. Her attempts to maintain grace looked like restraint. People treated her behaviour as though it contained clues waiting to be discovered. This shift placed her under a scrutiny she could neither anticipate nor escape. Even those who believed her innocent found themselves unsettled. They knew how easily reputations collapsed when questions accumulated. They also knew that the absence of explicit accusations did not protect her. Without a clear claim to refute, she remained incompatible with her own defense. She could not open a conversation about matters she had never heard, and she could not correct interpretations she did not know existed. Silence, her only available option, became an additional layer of suspicion for those already inclined to doubt her. The wife sensed that something around her had altered. Her interactions felt different, shaped by reactions she could not identify. Servants watched her with increased caution. Relatives spoke with softened politeness, and acquaintances avoided lingering near her. She recognized the signs of quiet distance, but she could not trace them to any specific event. The change did not announce itself. It spread through impressions that accumulated over days, wearing down her confidence without offering explanations. Those who sought to weaken her did not need to press further. They let the rumour evolve, trusting that the court's instinct for pattern-seeking would transform their initial suggestions into a more complete narrative. The wife's reputation, once stable, became the subject of speculation shaped by others' imagination rather than her own behaviour. Her virtue, previously taken for granted, now appeared fragile in the eyes of those who valued appearances over truth. This assault on her character did not require anger, confrontation, or malice. It required only the quiet willingness of listeners to see her differently. The court did not accuse her, it simply adjusted its expectations. People stepped back from her, not because they believed in her guilt, but because they feared being the last to notice what others claimed to have already seen. Her isolation deepened long before she understood how completely the ground beneath her had shifted. Her reputation changed, not through evidence, but through the weight of altered perception. The quiet withdrawal of those around her formed an atmosphere she could feel even when no one spoke. When the distance around her finally settled into something unmistakable, people began watching her with the expectation that something else would reveal itself. Attacks on a wife's position grew far more dangerous when directed at her role as a mother, for the legitimacy of children shaped inheritance, alliances, and the standing of an entire lineage. Whispered doubts about her virtue had already unsettled the household. But when those doubts shifted toward the origins of her children, they touched the core of Tudor anxieties. The court valued bloodlines with unrelenting seriousness, and those who aimed to undermine her needed only to disturb the fragile confidence surrounding her family. They did not challenge her openly. They merely adjusted how others interpreted the presence of her children. The earliest suggestions appeared subtle, almost accidental. Someone noted that one child resembled a distant cousin more than the father. Someone else remarked that the shape of the boy's face recalled a man frequently seen in the household corridors. These observations were spoken casually, without intention claimed or meaning acknowledged, and yet listeners absorbed them with a quiet unease. In a court where appearance carried legal and social consequences, resemblance became a tool more powerful than accusation. People did not need certainty. They needed only a reason to question. Rumors about lineage traveled in ways that ordinary gossip could not. They carried implications that threatened the entire structure of a family, and those who repeated them often framed their words as concern rather than suspicion. They wondered aloud whether the wife had seemed overly protective of the children lately, or whether she had refused to let certain relatives spend time with them. These observations suggested that she had something to hide, even if her behavior had not changed at all. Innocent choices became suspicious when reinterpreted through the lens of doubt. The mistresses who wished to push these rumors forward understood how deeply fathers feared public shame. A man of status risked losing credibility if others believed his line impure or uncertain. They shaped their strategy accordingly. They highlighted the wife's absences at crucial moments, implying that she might have sought companionship elsewhere. They emphasized the children's occasional differences in behavior or temperament, suggesting that such traits could not possibly have been inherited from the father's line. These suggestions, though unfounded, found fertile ground in a court eager to analyze every detail. No direct accusation was necessary. It was enough for someone to murmur that the wife had seemed unusually close to a particular advisor, or that she had spoken with someone in a secluded corner of the garden. These comments, combined with observations about the children, created a narrative that listeners assembled themselves. The wife's reputation as a mother, once unquestioned, now appeared vulnerable. Every gesture she made toward her children carried new significance. Her tenderness became a possible sign of guilt. Her discipline became a form of overcompensation. Her protectiveness became something to interpret rather than something to respect. The pressure on the husband intensified quietly. People approached him with cautious expressions and softened voices, offering sympathy for stresses he had not acknowledged. They hinted that he should pay closer attention to certain behaviors and suggested that he consider the future of his lineage with more scrutiny. They expressed worry about how quickly information traveled through the court and how easily misunderstandings could escalate. These conversations, framed as friendly advice, left him with mounting anxiety and no clear source to confront. Over time, he began studying his children with an intensity that made his wife uneasy. She noticed how his gaze lingered on their features. Searching for familiarity, he compared gestures, expression, and tones without explaining his concerns. His distance from her widened, not because he believed the rumors, but because he feared the consequences of ignoring them. The mistresses who had orchestrated these doubts did not need to push further. They simply observed as the husband carried the burden of suspicion on their behalf. The wife felt the shift long before she understood its origins. Her children, once a source of stability, became the center of a storm she could not see. Servants watched her interactions more closely. Relatives offered polite inquiries that carried subtle tension. She sensed that something fundamental had changed in how the household viewed her place within it. Her maternal authority weakened as others inserted themselves into decisions she had always overseen. People acted as though she were merely borrowing her own role. Her efforts to maintain calm only deepened the distance. The more she tried to appear steady, the more others interpreted her composure as performance. When she avoided conflict, they saw evasion. When she confronted concerns gently, they saw defensiveness. Every path she chose seemed designed, in their eyes, to conceal something. The rumor had done its work. Her behavior could no longer be seen without distortion. The weaponization of motherhood did not rely on facts, but on how easily people could be persuaded to question what they had always assumed. The court saw her in a new, unsettling frame, and once viewed through suspicion, even familiarity appeared suspect. Her children, innocent of all this, became symbols rather than individuals, and their mother became a figure whose worth was now measured by shadows rather than truth. Her standing weakened through implications rather than claims, turning her children into evidence that people believed they needed to examine. The growing discomfort around her reshaped the household in ways no one acknowledged directly. Once the unspoken belief took hold among those observing her, they began waiting for a moment that might confirm the story they had already begun to accept. Religion and moral expectations offered some of the most effective tools for reshaping how a wife was perceived, because they allowed suspicion to appear righteous rather than malicious. Those who wished to weaken her understood that people listened differently when concerns were framed as matters of virtue. They did not need to mention specific acts. They needed only to introduce the idea that she might no longer embody the qualities that society demanded from a respectable woman. In a court where outward piety earned protection and deviation invited scrutiny, even vague comments could alter the ground beneath her feet. The earliest murmurs came through references to sin, spoken in a distant, unfocused way. Someone lamented how easily people strayed from humility. Someone else reflected on the dangers of pride in women of status. These statements did not name her. Yet listeners instinctively connected the message to the atmosphere already surrounding her life. Doubt had been growing through previous rumors, and moral language attached itself naturally to the uncertainty forming around her reputation. No one asked whether the hints were justified. They accepted that moral decay always began quietly. The criticisms sharpened gradually, though never directly. Observers noted that her manner had grown too confident, that she no longer displayed the modesty expected of a wife of her standing. They claimed she spoke with an assertiveness bordering on impropriety, or that she appeared too composed during social gatherings. Such remarks, though mild, suggested a shift in her character that made further suspicion seem reasonable. In the Tudor court, a woman's virtue was measured through her restraint, and any perceived change could be reinterpreted as a sign of inward corruption. Those who pushed these ideas forward framed their comments as concern for the spiritual health of the household. They mentioned that unrest in a family often stemmed from moral imbalance. They hinted that God withheld favor from homes touched by hidden wrongdoing. These statements placed responsibility on the wife without naming her directly, allowing listeners to conclude while keeping the speaker protected. The power of religious language lay in its ability to sound impartial while targeting one person with precision. Her actions, previously neutral, became questionable through this lens. If she stood too tall, people saw pride. If she avoided unnecessary conversation, they saw secretiveness. If she appeared weary, they saw guilt wearing down her composure. Any behavior could be used as evidence, because the expectations placed upon her were impossible to perform flawlessly. Her attempts to maintain dignity seemed like deliberate concealment. Her silence, shaped by earlier rumors, now appeared to be proof. The Church's teachings on humility and obedience were frequently invoked in conversations that seemed unrelated at first glance. Someone recalled a sermon about the dangers of ungoverned desire. Another mentioned the importance of wives preserving harmony within the household. These comments subtly implied that she had failed in her obligations, even though no one linked the ideas directly to her name. The court was skilled at drawing connections without speaking them aloud. Mistresses who supported these rumors understood the advantage moral critique offered. They appeared virtuous simply by aligning themselves with accepted teachings. They expressed worry that the household had become spiritually unsettled. They claimed to respect the wife deeply, yet feared that recent events might reflect poorly on the family's reputation. Their language was gentle, restrained, and entirely calculated. By presenting themselves as women of moral sensitivity, they made the wife appear lacking in comparison. The husband absorbed these messages with growing discomfort. Although he could not identify a specific cause for concern, he felt pressured to preserve his family's honor. When acquaintances spoke of moral decline, he interpreted the comments as quiet warnings. He began studying his wife's conduct with a seriousness that strained their daily life. Her every gesture became something to evaluate. Her attempts to soothe tensions only convinced him that she was aware of the rumors herself. Servants contributed unintentionally to the worsening atmosphere. Their observations, shaped by conversations they overheard, filtered through the household in fragmented pieces. They repeated religious warnings as though they were small truths. They commented on her silence with unease, claiming that a virtuous woman had nothing to fear from open communication. These remarks circulated without malice, yet their cumulative effect isolated her further. The wife felt the shift in ways she could not articulate. She noticed how people paused before speaking to her, how they exchanged glances after she left a room, how her presence seemed to change the mood rather than steady it. Her attempts to remain steadfast, rooted in prayer, discipline, and order, were mistaken for effortful performance. Those who once admired her piety now treated it as an act crafted to disguise something unspoken. No accusation was ever required. By allowing moral language to brush against her reputation, others had redefined her standing, without taking responsibility for doing so. She became the subject of speculation that felt righteous to discuss. Her virtue, once unquestioned, now seemed to depend on the approval of people who no longer trusted their own memories of her. Her standing eroded through hints framed as spiritual guidance rather than malice. The tension created by these quiet judgments shaped how others viewed her most familiar qualities. After the idea of moral imbalance began to cling to the household, observers waited for some detail that might justify the discomfort they had already begun to feel. Moral language gained its sharpest edge once people realized it required no proof. The court had already learned to reshape uncertainty into certainty merely by repeating small concerns. And now the idea of virtue became a tool that allowed them to judge without declaring anything openly. The absence of evidence did not weaken their suspicions, it strengthened them, because it permitted the imagination to craft its own version of events. Those who spoke of righteousness did so with confidence that no one would challenge them. For challenging moral concern appeared improper in itself. The shift began quietly. Conversations framed as reflections on human weakness appeared in hallways, gardens, and chambers where servants lingered just long enough to carry fragments elsewhere. Someone wondered aloud whether humility had become rare among women of high status. Someone else remarked that spiritual decay often hid behind displays of composure. These statements floated freely, unattached to names, yet everyone knew where their meaning landed. They became part of the air, shaping how people reacted long before they understood how deeply they had absorbed the message. The wife felt the weight of those silent judgments in subtle ways. People greeted her politely, but their eyes shifted too quickly. Conversations paused when she approached. Even those who wished to remain kind acted with an unmistakable stiffness, as though uncertain how to stand near her without appearing complicit in something undisclosed. Their behavior suggested that they believed she carried a shadow with her, one they preferred not to look at directly. The tension was quiet but unmistakable. Her attempts to maintain dignity only seemed to deepen their suspicions. When she smiled, people interpreted the expression as forced. When she remained calm, they saw calculation. When she prayed longer than usual, they whispered that guilty souls often sought comfort through excess devotion. No action remained neutral. Each gesture acquired a second meaning as observers strained to match her behavior to the narrative forming around her. She could not reclaim control because she did not know which version of herself others believed they were witnessing. Those who pushed the moral critique forward did not need to speak harshly. They framed their comments as gentle reminders of virtue. They said they feared for the household's spiritual harmony. They expressed worry that reputation, once damaged, was difficult to repair. Their tone sounded compassionate, almost sorrowful, which made others feel justified in their concerns. The cruelty of their strategy lay in its softness. Nothing felt like an attack. Yet everything worked to isolate her. The husband found himself trapped between loyalty and public impression. He did not know whether the rumors held, but he understood the consequences of ignoring them. Men of status risked their credibility when accused of tolerating impropriety within their homes. Even unconfirmed whispers could weaken alliances, sow distrust among relatives, or call the legitimacy of children into question. The pressure forced him into distance, not because he believed she had erred, but because he feared appearing foolish or blind if others thought she had. The children, though innocent, sensed the tension. Servants behaved more stiffly around them, and relatives offered them unusually measured affection. They heard the softened voices that followed their mother's name, and though they did not understand the words, they understood the tone. The household's atmosphere thickened around them, shaping their behavior in ways neither parent could fully see. As the rumors matured, moral judgment became a communal exercise. People did not consider themselves cruel. They believed they were discerning. They felt responsible for interpreting signs correctly, as though vigilance equaled virtue. Observers began to treat her as a cautionary figure, someone who needed to be watched rather than trusted. Their silence toward her was not neutral. It was a verdict delivered without the need for discussion. The wife, caught inside this tightening circle, recognized that she had lost ground she could not identify. She could defend herself against accusations, but she could not defend herself against tones, glances, and assumptions. Nothing explicit had been said, yet everything around her had changed. She lived within a sentence that had never been spoken, delivered by people who believed they were merely noticing what had already been true. Moral scrutiny became a weapon precisely because it claimed not to be one. It allowed people to feel righteous while withdrawing from her. It allowed them to behave harshly while believing they were protecting the household. It allowed them to condemn her without acknowledging they had judged her at all. The power of this judgment lay in its invisibility. She could not confront an enemy that took the form of collective thought. The shift in moral perception tightened around her, without requiring a single explicit charge. People treated her with a careful distance, shaped entirely by what they believed they had sensed rather than heard. Once this quiet verdict settled into the household, those watching her waited for some moment that might confirm the conclusion they already carried in silence. Efforts to weaken a wife's position gained new strength when directed at the relationships that anchored her. Friends and relatives formed the quiet structure of her daily life, offering reassurance when court politics grew tense. Those who wished to undermine her understood that isolating her required more than damaging her reputation. It required loosening the ties that connected her to people who might defend her. They approached this process with patience, knowing that separation happened most effectively through suggestion rather than confrontation. The earliest attempts took the form of gentle remarks delivered with feigned reluctance. Someone wondered whether her closest confidant had been giving too much of herself without receiving anything in return. Someone else hinted that the wife often relied on others' goodwill, without acknowledging the weight of what they carried for her. These observations sounded like kindness, shaped as concern for those around her. But they planted a subtle idea. The wife might be using the people she loved. Small misunderstandings became opportunities for deeper division. If a relative arrived late to a gathering, whispers suggested that the wife had been offended. If she paused before responding to a question, someone claimed she had grown distant. Even harmless inconsistencies were reframed as signs of strain. These interpretations did not need to convince everyone. They needed only to introduce uncertainty. Doubt rarely replaced trust all at once. It seeped into spaces where confidence had once existed, transforming ordinary moments into sources of discomfort. The manipulations intensified through careful timing. Someone noted that the wife had not thanked a cousin properly for a recent favor. Another recalled that she had once turned away from a friend during a celebration. as though withholding affection. These remarks relied on selective memory, emphasizing details that remained insignificant until placed in a new frame. Those who heard them reconsidered events they had long forgotten, reconstructing their impressions according to the stories being woven around them. Her enemies knew that relationships did not fail because of grand conflicts. They fractured through hesitation. They exploited this by raising questions about loyalty. They asked whether the wife confided in others only when it served her interests. They wondered if she shared more with some people than others, implying favoritism. These ideas suggested that the wife valued relationships not for closeness, but for advantage. An accusation that resonated painfully in a court where alliances determined survival. Friends and relatives, though initially dismissive, began watching her more carefully. They noticed how she carried herself during gatherings, how she responded to small gestures, and how she interacted with children and elders. What they observed had not changed. What they believed they were observing had. Their interpretations became cautious, shaped by the unsettling possibility that they had misread her for years. They did not confront her, they simply stepped back slightly, leaving a gap she could not identify. The wife sensed that her world was tightening, though she could not name the source. Expressions that once conveyed warmth now felt measured. Conversations that had flowed easily now contained pauses. She felt as though people approached her with a boundary she had never created. Efforts to engage more openly did not help. They were met with polite reserve, as though her attempts were too deliberate. Every gesture she made, every smile, every question, was interpreted as strategy rather than sincerity. Her opponents continued shaping the narrative quietly. They suggested that the household had become tense because she had grown demanding. They claimed she had unknowingly alienated those who had once supported her. None of these statements were direct accusation. They were spoken as worries shared reluctantly, creating the illusion that the speaker wished to protect her relationships rather than erode them. The effect, however, was unmistakable. Her allies began doubting their own closeness to her. Over time, these divisions deepened without confrontation. Members of her family expressed less confidence in her. Friends visited less often. Some shifted their attention towards safer social circles. These changes reinforced themselves, creating the impression that she had become difficult to connect with. Isolation presented itself as a natural consequence of her behavior, even though it originated from the quiet manipulations of those who benefited from her collapse. The wife struggled to understand why familiar faces now felt distant. She searched for explanations, reviewing past conversations for moments she might have misinterpreted. The more she tried to repair what she believed she had disrupted, the more strained her interactions became. Attempts to restore closeness looked forced, confirming suspicions invented by others. The isolation worked not because of what she had done, but because of what others believed she might have done. Her loneliness grew in silence, forming an invisible boundary between her and the people who once anchored her life. They had not confronted her. They had not accused her. They had simply adjusted their understanding of her, each believing they had acted out of caution rather than influence. The separation felt natural to them, even as it suffocated her. Her connections weakened through doubts shaped by those who never named their intentions. Subtle distance replaced the familiarity that once sustained her. After those around her accepted a gentler version of mistrust, they began waiting for signs that their caution had been justified all along. Manipulating a husband's emotions required precision, patience, and an understanding of how deeply a man's public image shaped his choices in the Tudor court. Those who wished to weaken his wife did not begin with accusations. They began with concern. The husband, surrounded by pressures he could not acknowledge openly, became most vulnerable when approached through the language of loyalty. The mistresses who pursued this strategy understood that threats to a man's dignity landed harder than threats to his household, and they shaped their actions around this truth. Their first step was to express worry for his reputation, never for their own. They spoke softly, as though reluctant to mention what troubled them. They phrased their remarks as observations they wished they had not made. They wondered whether others in the court misunderstood his wife's behaviour. They feared people might misinterpret her silences or her absences. They claimed they did not believe these impressions themselves. Yet their hesitation conveyed far more than their words. By appearing cautious and hesitant, they planted the idea that he, too, should be cautious. These conversations did not accuse the wife of wrongdoing. They suggested she was allowing whispers to form around him. That distinction mattered. A husband could dismiss criticism directed at his spouse, but criticism framed as a threat to his own honour demanded attention. The mistresses emphasized that they spoke out of devotion to him. They worried, they said, that people who envied his position used his wife's behaviour to undermine his standing. They insisted they had no desire to interfere, but they could not bear to see him treated unfairly. Once this concern took hold, they introduced comparisons. Subtle at first, then more pointed. They highlighted their own loyalty, their attentiveness, their understanding of his burdens. They reminded him of moments when they had comforted him during political tensions or stood by him during disputes. They contrasted this with the wife's supposed distance or unpredictability. These comparisons did not need to be explicit. A sigh at the right moment, a lowered gaze, or a quiet remark about what some women failed to appreciate carried the message effectively. Men of the Tudor court, conditioned to believe in their own entitlement and authority, responded strongly to such emotional cues. Their pride, constantly tested by rivals and shifting alliances, made them receptive to validation. The mistresses offered that validation freely. They described him as misunderstood, as a man burdened by unrecognized responsibilities, as someone whose loyalty was not always returned in equal measure. Their praise felt gentle and sincere, a stark contrast to the uncertainty he now sensed from his wife. This emotional imbalance deepened when the mistresses positioned themselves as protectors. They implied that they worried for him more than his wife did. They suggested that they pay attention to the details she overlooked. They portrayed their presence as stabilizing, their affection as unconditional, their devotion as something he could rely upon without question. These claims appealed to his self-image, reinforcing the idea that he deserved unwavering loyalty. The husband, already troubled by the court's whispers, found comfort in this attention. He began interpreting his wife's behaviour through the framework the mistresses had created. Her caution seemed cold. Her attempts to maintain composure appeared indifferent. Her silence looked like neglect. The mistresses, meanwhile, presented their own restraint as sensitivity. They spoke softly, listened closely, and offered reassurance without overstepping. The contrast formed a narrative that needed no explanation. One woman caused him stress. The other soothed it. As doubt grew, the mistresses shifted to highlighting his sacrifices. They reflected on his efforts to uphold his household status. They wondered whether he received enough appreciation for the weight he carried. They praised his integrity and resilience. These compliments awakened his self-regard, making him more receptive to the idea that he deserved better treatment. His frustrations, once fleeting, turned into lasting irritations. Eventually, he began distancing himself from his wife. Not out of anger, but out of weariness. He felt misunderstood, unvalued, and unrecognized. The mistresses observed this change quietly and continued offering comfort that seemed natural rather than strategic. They reinforced the idea that emotional fulfillment came from them, not from the woman they had married. His alienation did not appear intentional. It emerged as a gradual realignment of affections, shaped entirely by how he interpreted his own importance. The wife noticed the shift immediately. His gaze lingered less. His tone softened into formality. His presence in shared spaces grew inconsistent. She sensed that something in him had closed, though she did not know when or why. Her efforts to reconnect only reinforced the narrative forming in his mind, because the mistresses had already planted the idea that she acted out of guilt rather than affection. Every gesture she made risked confirming the suspicions he no longer admitted he held. The manipulation succeeded because it did not attack the wife. It elevated the husband. By flattering his pride and presenting themselves as emotionally aligned with him, the mistresses made the wife appear distant without proving anything. He believed he had reached these conclusions himself, which made him trust them all the more. His loyalty shifted through emotions, shaped carefully around his sense of dignity. The distance between husband and wife deepened as he sought reassurance from those who praised rather than questioned him. Once this emotional divide became familiar to him, observers waited to see how far the separation might continue to grow. Shaping oneself into a victim became one of the most effective strategies for influencing a husband already unsettled by suspicion. Those who pursued this path understood that sympathy altered judgment far more effectively than accusation, rather than positioning themselves as rivals to the wife. They presented themselves as vulnerable figures caught unintentionally in the tension surrounding the household. This approach allowed them to gain the husband's emotional loyalty without appearing manipulative, and it redirected his frustrations toward his wife. With subtlety he struggled to recognize. The effort began with small displays of discomfort, hesitations in their speech, lowered eyes, or a trembling tone that seemed impossible to feign. They implied that the wife had spoken harshly to them or treated them with unprovoked disdain. These remarks were framed as confessions, reluctantly shared. They insisted they did not want to cause trouble, and that they understood the wife might be under stress. Their restraint made their claims appear credible. By acting as though they wished to protect the wife's dignity, they convinced the husband that they were the ones being unfairly treated. As these emotional cues deepened, they grew more explicit in their vulnerability. They allowed their voices to falter when mentioning encounters with their wives. They avoided looking directly at the husband, suggesting embarrassment or fear. They insisted they did not wish to burden him, yet seemed unable to contain their distress. These fragile performances activated something powerful in him, the desire to shield someone who appeared gentle and wronged. He saw them not as instigators, but as casualties of tension he believed came from his wife's declining composure. Once they sensed his protective instinct forming, they expanded the narrative. They described moments when the wife had ignored their greetings, corrected them sharply, or dismissed comments meant only to be helpful. None of these accounts needed to be dramatic. They merely needed to sound plausible. The husband, already predisposed to interpret his wife's behavior through a harsher lens, accepted these stories without requiring proof. Each new detail reinforced his belief that the wife had grown hostile toward innocent parties. To strengthen the emotional contrast, the mistresses emphasized their own fragility. They suggested that court politics overwhelmed them, that they often felt insignificant, and that unkindness affected them more deeply than it should. Their perceived weakness did not make them seem powerless. Instead, it highlighted the husband's strength, inviting him to see himself as the source of stability they lacked. His role shifted from partner to protector, a transformation that quietly distanced him further from his wife. They also framed their vulnerability as something they regretted. They apologized for taking up his time. They insisted they wished they were stronger. They claimed they did not want their presence to disrupt his household. These statements created the illusion that they were resisting manipulation, which made the manipulation significantly more effective. By appearing reluctant to burden him, they ensured he felt compelled to offer comfort. The husband, now emotionally invested, began searching for explanations that aligned with what he had been told. When his wife spoke sharply, he interpreted it as hostility toward those who meant her no harm. When she displayed sadness, he viewed it as guilt. When she attempted to repair the tension, he saw it as strategic rather than sincere. His perception shifted gradually until he believed he was witnessing the behavior described to him. The mistresses no longer needed to feed the narrative. He reinforced it himself. As his sympathy grew, so did his distance from his wife. He shared more private thoughts with the mistresses, trusting their listening ears and gentle reactions. He felt understood, validated, and appreciated. The wife, in contrast, appeared increasingly critical and demanding, not because she had changed, but because he now saw her through the lens of his own emotional realignment. The mistress's victimhood made her seem like the aggressor even in moments when she acted with restraint. The wife noticed the imbalance quickly. She sensed that interactions were being interpreted in ways she had not intended. Efforts to speak plainly were received as harshness. Attempts to maintain dignity appeared cold. Any sign of frustration confirmed assumptions she could not see. She realized that someone had placed her in a narrative she had no part in shaping, one in which she had become the source of pain for people she barely noticed. Her confusion only strengthened the husband's belief that she lacked empathy. The manipulation succeeded because it transformed ordinary emotions into evidence. The mistress's distress looked sincere, their hesitations genuine, their silence wounded. The husband believed he was defending the innocent, not undermining his wife. His actions felt honorable to him, even as they eroded the foundation of his marriage. Her position weakened through sympathy, redirected toward others who claimed to suffer because of her. The husband's desire to protect those who appeared fragile reshaped his understanding of his own household. Once he embraced the role of guardian, observers waited to see how fully he would commit to it at her expense. The shift in sympathy had grown so complete that the wife, though placed at the center of every whisper, was no longer seen as the one suffering. Instead, the court's attention drifted toward those who had positioned themselves as wounded by her supposed behavior. The mistresses perfected the role with quiet precision. Their sadness appeared unforced, their hesitations unstudied, their discomfort so understated that observers believed it must have come from somewhere real. They did not argue, confront, or demand. They simply allowed others to notice what they pretended to hide. Their sorrow reshaped conversations long before the wife understood how deeply the narrative had changed. Servants offered them softer tones. Ladies at court approached them with gentle curiosity, asking whether they were well. Even men who normally ignored their presence stopped to acknowledge their pale expressions or uncertain smiles. These gestures created a sense of collective agreement. Someone had hurt them, and that someone, unspoken but widely assumed, was the wife. The mistress's supposed pain made them appear earnest, and earnestness persuaded even those who distrusted gossip. The husband, caught between troubled whispers and visible sadness, interpreted the mistress's discomfort as a personal betrayal. His pride, already worn down by weeks of uncertainty, reacted sharply to the idea that his wife had mistreated those who seemed devoted to him. He felt wounded, not by anything the wife had said, but by what he believed she had made others feel. His sense of loyalty tightened around the mistresses precisely because he believed they had remained loyal to him despite how they had been treated. Their tears, soft voices, and reluctance to speak reinforced the idea that they suffered silently rather than complain. He began withdrawing from his wife, not through anger but through disappointment. His glances grew shorter, his tone flatter, his conversations with her less open. He viewed her with uneasy caution, convinced that she could not see the emotional harm she caused. In his eyes, she had not betrayed him through disloyalty but through coldness, through an inability to recognize the feelings of others. His assumptions made it impossible for him to hear her clearly. Even her attempts to address the changes between them appeared self-interested, confirming the narrative the mistresses had built with such care. The wife felt the consequences long before she understood their source. She noticed that people responded to her differently, as though bracing for something unpleasant. Her presence no longer eased tension. It created it. Individuals who once sought her counsel now avoided lingering in conversation. She sensed that something unspoken followed her into every room. Attempts to reconnect with her husband were met with polite distance. Attempts to speak with others were met with reassurances she had not asked for. She realized that she had become a figure people pitied privately but did not defend publicly. Every word she spoke seemed to carry unintended meaning. If she asked a simple question, listeners wondered what emotion lay beneath it. If she attempted to clarify a misunderstanding, they treated her explanation as deflection. Her voice, once respected, became a source of suspicion. People assumed she was hiding anger, hiding guilt, hiding some flaw they believed they had glimpsed. Her efforts to maintain composure only intensified these beliefs. Silence felt unsafe, but speech felt even more dangerous. Around her, the mistresses remained quiet, their sadness steady and consistent. They did not approach her. They did not accuse her. They did not challenge her. Their restraint made them appear gracious, while the wife's confusion appeared defensive. Those observing the situation did not see the traps that had been laid. They saw only two emotional landscapes, one soft, one strained, and instinctively favored the softer one. In a court where perception mattered more than truth, emotion became evidence. The wife's isolation deepened further each time her husband offered comfort to someone else instead of her. She watched from a distance as he soothed the very people shaping her downfall. His tenderness toward them became a painful reminder of how little he now trusted her. He believed she was responsible for their suffering, and the more he tried to protect them, the more he unknowingly contributed to her disappearance from her own life. She became a figure still present in the household, yet no longer consulted, respected, or believed. This imbalance did not emerge from a single moment. It accumulated slowly, layer by layer, until the wife found herself standing in a silence she did not create. Once others accepted that she had harmed those around her, they felt justified in refusing to hear her side. Their refusal was not stated openly. It lived in softened tones, careful expressions, and the absence of invitation. The mistress's victimhood had become a shield that deflected scrutiny away from them and directed it toward her. Her voice, once steady, now reached no one. Her grievances sounded exaggerated. Her explanations sounded rehearsed. Her pain sounded like anger. She had been cast into a role without her consent, the source of suffering for those who appeared gentle. And the cruelest part was that no direct accusation had been made. Only impressions, gestures, and silence. Her decline unfolded through sympathy redirected toward others who claimed fragility. The husband's growing sense of betrayal shaped how every interaction between them was interpreted. When her voice slipped beneath the weight of their sorrow, observers waited to see whether she would vanish from the household's influence entirely. Silence, once seen as a mark of dignity, became the most dangerous weapon turned against the wife. Those who sought to undermine her understood that words could be defended, but silence could be rewritten endlessly. A quiet moment, a paused breath, a refusal to engage. Each could be interpreted in ways she never intended. The court, already conditioned by weeks of shifting rumors. I've learned to treat her restraint not as composure, but as proof of something hidden. She did not change how she behaved. Others changed how they interpreted her. People noticed first how rarely she defended herself, when accusations had not yet formed clearly enough to challenge. Her silence appeared understandable. But as suspicion grew, that same silence began to look like avoidance. Observers wondered why she did not speak out if she had nothing to fear. They questioned why she seemed unwilling to address the tension around her. Her attempts to maintain dignity made them uneasy, as though she were protecting a truth too fragile to expose. Each time she chose not to respond, they filled the space with their own fears. The mistresses took advantage of this shift without appearing involved. They presented themselves as reluctant witnesses, claiming they did not want to misunderstand the wife's behavior. They wondered aloud whether her quietness concealed resentment They worried that her composure signaled disapproval of others. Their voices trembled just enough to imply concern rather than accusation. In this carefully shaped atmosphere, the wife's silence seemed increasingly threatening, as though she were withholding judgment until the right moment to strike. Her reactions, even the smallest ones, became subject to scrutiny. If she frowned in thought, it was seen as disdain. If she hesitated before answering, it appeared calculated. If she looked away, people assumed she was hiding irritation. No gesture could remain simple. The burden of interpretation shifted entirely onto those watching her, and they interpreted everything through the lens of suspicion. She became the only person in the court whose silence felt louder than speech. Her husband struggled the most to understand her quietness. He remembered a time when her restraint comforted him, when her steady presence grounded their household. Now he saw the same qualities as signs of emotional distance. He interpreted her silence as judgment, as disapproval, as confirmation of what others had hinted. When she attempted to regulate her tone, he viewed it as coldness. When she tried to choose her words carefully, he saw manipulation. He no longer believed in her ease. He believed in her strategy. This misinterpretation pushed her into a defensive posture she did not know how to escape. The more she tried to maintain calm, the more her calmness seemed incriminating. She found herself rehearsing sentences before speaking, afraid that the wrong word would deepen the growing divide. She avoided expressing frustration because she knew it would be used against her. She avoided expressing sadness because it appeared too conveniently timed. Her silence expanded not because she wished to hide something, but because she no longer trusted any response to land truthfully. The court noticed her withdrawal and treated it as confirmation rather than a consequence. They whispered that she had grown aloof, distant, possibly even contemptuous of the people around her. They claimed she resented the sympathy the mistresses had received. They speculated that she plotted privately, preparing for a confrontation that only she anticipated. Their imaginations filled the void her silence left behind, transforming her restraint into a story she had never told. Friends she once trusted stepped back quietly. They interpreted her distance as personal rather than protective. They assumed she no longer valued their companionship. Her relatives, already shaken by earlier doubts, hesitated to approach her with the same openness as before. Her world shrank into corridors where she walked alone, aware that each step was being watched. Silence had become both her shield and her prison, protecting her from direct conflict while trapping her in a narrative she could not dismantle. Those who orchestrated her downfall understood that silence could be stretched indefinitely. They did not need her to speak. They needed her to keep quiet long enough for everyone else to draw their own conclusions. They relied on the court's habit of assigning meaning to what they could not explain. They depended on her dignity, knowing she would rather endure discomfort than engage in public disputes. Her restraint became their strongest ally, the very quality that once protected her, now reshaping her identity in the eyes of those around her. The wife realized too late that no answer she gave could undo what silence had already built. Her words, when finally spoken, sounded inadequate, as though she were responding to accusations she did not fully understand. People listened politely but dismissed her explanations as too measured, too careful, too practiced. They heard not her truth, but the tone of a woman they believed had something to defend. Her silence transformed from dignity into suspicion as others rewrote its meaning. The reactions shaped around her forced her into a defensive stillness she could not escape. After her quietness became the court's preferred evidence, observers waited for any gesture that might reveal what they believed she had been hiding all along. Small mistakes, once unremarkable, became the most powerful tools used against the wife. Those who wished to weaken her understood that subtle errors carried more weight than dramatic failures in a court where perception mattered more than fact. They did not need to invent wrongdoing. They only needed to reinterpret ordinary moments until they resembled patterns of guilt. The court, already shaped by rumors, welcomed any detail that seemed to confirm what they feared they had overlooked. Every slip became a clue. Every oversight became a warning. The first object of scrutiny was a letter. Brief, unfinished, and lacking clarity. It contained nothing incriminating, merely an ambiguous phrase that could be read in several ways. Under normal circumstances, no one would have questioned it. Yet once exposed to the climate of suspicion, the letter became a piece of evidence that people believed required interpretation. They examined her wording with unnatural attention, assigning meaning to pauses, imagining emphasis where none existed. Her handwriting, once admired, now appeared hurried or evasive. What she had intended as a private note took on the weight of a confession. Whispers formed quickly around the letter. Some suggested she had written it in secret. Others believed she had attempted to hide it. The mistresses did not need to present it as proof. They simply expressed confusion about its tone. They wondered aloud whether she had been communicating with someone she did not wish the household to know about. They claimed they only raised the question because they cared about the family's stability. Their feigned concern allowed the suspicions to grow without exposing their involvement. The next incident emerged through a conversation overheard and retold. The wife had spoken plainly to a servant, offering a brief instruction. Yet by the time the story returned to her, the message had changed entirely. A pause became irritation. A simple directive became a rebuke. A neutral comment became a veiled threat. Those who repeated the account did not believe they were lying. They believed they were clarifying feelings they thought they had sensed. Emotion, once added to the retelling, overpowered the original meaning. The conversation no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the court's imagination. Even her expressions became material for suspicion. A momentary glance, a flicker of thought across her face, was retold as though it had been a held stare. Observers added details they believed they remembered: tightened lips, narrowed eyes, a shift in posture. None of these details were real. Yet repetition gave them form. People believed the story not because it was accurate, but because it aligned with the atmosphere that had already taken hold. Every retelling amplified the intensity until the original moment disappeared completely. The wife found herself defending actions she did not recall performing. She searched her memory for moments that could have been misunderstood, reviewing her interactions to understand how they had acquired such meaning. She recognized that she had no way to correct the past. Once others agreed upon a version of events, her truth became irrelevant. The more she denied the interpretations, the more defensive she appeared. Her attempts to explain herself created new stories, new misunderstandings, and new reasons for people to doubt her sincerity. The court's response to these small incidents revealed more about their fears than her actions. People wanted clarity in a situation filled with unease. By turning tiny inconsistencies into major concerns, they felt they were protecting themselves from being deceived. Uncertainty frightened them more than false conclusions did. They preferred to believe in patterns that did not exist, rather than admit they did not understand her. And because they lacked real evidence, they relied on the evidence they could manufacture from ordinary life. The husband reacted quietly at first. He told himself he was only being cautious. He studied the letter, questioning its tone. He replayed the misinterpreted conversation, wondering whether he had missed signs of frustration in her voice. He listened to accounts of her expressions, comparing them to the memories he carried. His doubts did not emerge suddenly. They grew by accumulation. Each small misunderstanding became a thread tugging at his certainty, loosening it slowly, steadily. The wife felt this shift even before he spoke of it. His questions grew sharper. Though his voice remained calm, his gaze lingered on her face. Not with affection, but with analysis. She saw him measuring her reactions, searching for hidden meaning. The trust that once allowed them to speak freely diminished without argument, replaced by an invisible barrier made of assumptions neither could acknowledge. She felt as though she were standing behind glass, visible yet unreachable. Her isolation deepened as others contributed their interpretations. A cousin mentioned that she seemed distracted. A servant recalled that she appeared tense. A friend hesitated before accepting her invitation, claiming she might be too busy. None of these observations was hostile. They were merely shaped by the narrative now surrounding her. She became a figure interpreted rather than understood. A woman whose smallest actions carried implications she did not intend. The transformation was complete when people began expecting her mistakes. They examined her behavior not out of curiosity, but out of certainty that something was wrong. Once, expectation replaced observation. Reality no longer mattered. Her life became a collection of misread moments arranged into a story she had never lived. Her ordinary actions hardened into accusations crafted from fragments of misunderstanding. The household learned to read guilt into every small detail, as though waiting for confirmation of a truth they believed they had already glimpsed. After these minor errors took on the weight of a larger meaning, observers watched her more closely, convinced that something even more revealing might emerge. Influence inside the Tudor court rarely emerged through open alliances. It grew quietly between people who understood the value of subtle cooperation. Those seeking to weaken the wife recognized that their power increased not through confrontation, but through the steady accumulation of allies who could carry whispers into corners they themselves could not reach. They approached this task with deliberate care, knowing that reputation spread fastest when shaped by many voices rather than one. Their first step was to cultivate friendships with other noblewomen, women who held social authority, observed every detail around them, and shared information with ease. These relationships were built on small gestures, a sympathetic glance during a tense moment, a compliment offered with sincerity, an invitation to walk together through the gardens. Such interactions seemed harmless. They established trust without revealing the purpose behind them. The women they approached believed they were forming new bonds of companionship, unaware they were being drawn into a web of calculated influence. Once these connections solidified, the mistresses began introducing fragments of the ongoing narrative. They never spoke harshly of the wife. Instead, they expressed uncertainty, confusion, or quiet worry. They wondered whether she felt overwhelmed. They suggested she had seemed distant. They implied that something about her behavior unsettled them, though they could not say why. These remarks did not accuse, they invited interpretation. The noblewomen who heard them began examining the wife more closely, searching for signs that matched the feelings they had been encouraged to notice. As these women formed their own impressions, shaped by the expectations planted in them, they carried the story onward. They shared their observations with friends, relatives, or attendants, each time adding subtle variations influenced by their personal experiences. The narrative multiplied not through malice, but through participation. Each retelling felt like an independent conclusion, even though all conclusions had begun from the same carefully designed seed. The mistresses no longer needed to guide the process. The court guided itself. The rumours gained momentum as they travelled through different social groups. Some repeated them in drawing rooms, others in corridors, others still in the privacy of their carriages. Each environment reshaped the story slightly, giving it a new tone and a new audience. By the time the whispers reached people of higher rank, they had grown into observations spoken with confidence, as though everyone had known the truth all along. The wife's reputation no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the collective imagination of the court. The most effective part of this strategy was the illusion of universality. People began phrases with "everyone says," or "I heard from several sources," even though the same handful of women had carried the rumour from one circle to the next. The sensation that the entire court shared a single understanding created a pressure few dared to challenge. Those who doubted remained silent, unwilling to appear uninformed or naive. Those who believed spoke more boldly. The idea that everyone knew became more powerful than anything the wife could claim. The wife sensed the shift through subtle changes in behavior. Women who once greeted her warmly now offered smiles that stopped short of sincerity. Conversations paused when she entered a room. People exchanged glances that she could not interpret. When she asked questions, answers arrived too quickly or too carefully, as though rehearsed. She felt herself becoming the center of something she could not see, an invisible current moving around her, shaping how others reacted to her presence before she spoke a word. Her attempts to clarify the situation only made the atmosphere tighter. Those she approached responded politely, but with an undercurrent of stiffness. They assured her nothing was wrong, yet their expressions contradicted their words. Some offered sympathy she had not requested. Others avoided her altogether, fearing involvement in a matter they believed everyone already understood. Her isolation deepened, not through hostility, but through the refined withdrawal of people who believed they were behaving appropriately. Meanwhile, the mistresses maintained their innocence. They never appeared at the center of the rumor's growth. They continued speaking gently, behaving graciously, and avoiding any statement that could be traced back to them. Their influence spread precisely because they disguised it within the voices of others. By the time the court recognized that a transformation had occurred, the mistresses no longer needed to act. The alliance they had built sustained itself. Her fate shifted as the narrative spread through voices that believed they were acting independently. The impression of universal agreement created a silence too oppressive for her to break. Once the court accepted the illusion that everyone already knew the truth, observers waited for the moment that would confirm what they believed had always been certain. Judgment inside the Tudor court did not require a courtroom, a verdict, or even a spoken accusation. It unfolded instead through a collective turning away. Quiet, calculated, and devastating. By the time the wife realized what had happened, the shift had already settled into the routines, gestures, and silences of everyone around her. No one claimed responsibility. No one confronted her. Yet every interaction reminded her that she now occupied a place outside the circle she once belonged to. The process began subtly. People who once greeted her warmly now nodded with polite brevity. Conversations she approached dissolved into careful pauses. Women she had known for years positioned themselves a step farther away, not enough to be disrespectful, but far enough to signal difference. Their smiles looked practiced, their voices softened by distance, their attention drifting towards safer company. Each moment felt small in isolation, yet together they formed a landscape of cold recognition. She had become someone to avoid. The absence of a formal accusation made the situation more suffocating. There was nothing to refute, no specific charge she could confront. Instead, she faced a silence shaped by assumptions she had never heard expressed. When she attempted to address the discomfort around her, people responded with gentle confusion, claiming they noticed nothing unusual. Their denial sounded sincere, even though their behavior contradicted every word. She realized that the court preferred ambiguity because ambiguity allowed them to withdraw without appearing cruel. Servants followed the example of their superiors. Their movements around her grew more careful. Their eyes lowered, not out of respect, but out of self-protection. They answered her questions with measured formality, avoiding the familiarity they had once shown. They treated her as though she carried an unseen burden that might spread if they grew too close. Their behavior confirmed what the noblewomen had already signaled. She no longer represented authority, safety, or belonging. Her relatives reacted with a different kind of distance. Subtle, apologetic, and tinged with fear. They avoided discussing household matters in her presence, fearing that aligning themselves with her might threaten their own standing. They reassured her that nothing was wrong. Yet they attended fewer gatherings with her and shortened their visits. Their retreat did not come from disbelief in her innocence, but from belief in the danger of being associated with someone the court had quietly marked. The husband, already unsettled by weeks of whispering, became increasingly uncertain of how to behave. He did not openly reject her, but he no longer moved toward her either. His silences grew longer. His eyes softened into sympathy rather than trust. He treated her as someone fragile, unpredictable, or wounded, yet never as someone wronged. He believed he was offering calm neutrality. But she felt the weight of his withdrawal more deeply than any spoken criticism. His hesitation suggested that he, too, now saw her through the court's shifting perspective. What made the isolation devastating was its quiet stability. No one argued with her. No one questioned her openly. Instead, they behaved as though the matter had already been settled elsewhere, beyond her reach. She sensed that the entire household now operated with a shared understanding she could not access. Rooms felt colder, not because of their stone walls, but because of the absence of acknowledgement within them. She stood among people who looked at her without truly seeing her. Her attempts to regain her footing only intensified the discomfort. When she reached out for conversation, people stepped back. When she tried to join activities, others subtly rearranged themselves to exclude her, without appearing direct. When she attempted to address the growing distance, listeners responded with confusion, feigned innocence, or gentle dismissal. She realized that confronting the problem would only make her appear desperate or volatile. Interpretations the court would welcome. Isolation became her only companion. She walked through hallways where her footsteps sounded louder than they once had, a reminder of how little remained to anchor her. The absence of accusation meant there would be no opportunity for defense. The absence of a verdict meant there would be no resolution. The judgment placed upon her was not meant to be proven or disproven. It was meant to linger, shaping every perception until she faded from relevance. In the end, her downfall did not arrive through scandal or dramatic revelation. It arrived through absence, the absence of support, of belief, of voices willing to speak her name without hesitation. The court had turned away not with anger, but with certainty that she no longer mattered. Her world collapsed through quiet rejection. Not explicit accusation. The withdrawal of those around her formed a verdict no one needed to speak aloud. When the court embraced this silent distance, people watched her carefully, waiting for any sign that might justify the judgment they had already accepted. Reputation in the Tudor court did not erode suddenly. It thinned gradually, losing its structure, one careful layer at a time. By the time suspicion had settled around the wife, people no longer needed rumors to guide their perception. They reacted to her through instinct rather than thought, as though uncertainty had become the only lens through which she could be seen. Her name, once spoken with respect, now carried a quiet tension. The shift was not loud enough to be called a scandal, yet persistent enough to reshape how every person approached her. The first sign appeared in the glances directed toward her. Brief, assessing, edged with questions no one voiced. These looks lingered just long enough for her to notice, then slid away before she could identify their intention. People behaved as though they were still deciding what they believed, even though the decision had already settled within them. Their uncertainty permitted them to hold her at a distance. She felt their hesitation in every gathering, sensing that she had become someone whose presence required caution. As days passed, the loss of social support became unmistakable. Those who once greeted her with warmth now offered restrained acknowledgement. Invitations that once arrived regularly dwindled without explanation. Women who had visited her freely now sent polite excuses instead. Even small gestures, shared laughter, whispered confidences, and familiar touches on the arm fell away quietly. Her routines, once shaped by companionship, became marked by empty spaces where friends had been. The court, always sensitive to shifts in behavior. He observed this distancing and adopted it quickly. People followed patterns they did not question. Convinced that withdrawing from her was prudent, they avoided aligning themselves with her, not out of animosity, but because caution within the court always felt like wisdom. Her diminishing circle of allies became proof to others that something was indeed wrong. They assumed that silence indicated knowledge. That absence indicated judgment. Her declining status became self-reinforcing. Servants mirrored the behavior of their superiors. They complied with her requests, but without familiarity. They no longer volunteered information or anticipated her needs. Their answers grew shorter, their steps quicker, their expressions more controlled. They interacted with her as though they feared misreading her intentions. Even those who had once trusted her treated her with a formality that implied risk. She became a figure they served rather than a figure they supported. What made the erosion of her reputation most painful was its invisibility. No one accused her directly. No one confronted her with claims she could refute. Instead, her standing fell through omissions, through conversations she was excluded from, through decisions made without her knowledge, through doorways left open for others, but closed to her. She moved through rooms where she felt increasingly peripheral, her presence acknowledged yet no longer wanted. Her husband's behavior compounded the damage, though he did not openly condemn her. His cautious distance signaled to others that he, too, had doubts. People interpreted his restraint as confirmation that their suspicions were justified. His silence reshaped hers. The more he withheld his trust, the more the court believed she had lost it. His uncertainty became a powerful weapon, even though he never intended it to be. Wives in the Tudor court stood or fell upon their husband's confidence, and her footing had begun to crumble. External relationships also began to shift. Families who had once aligned themselves with her household reconsidered their position, unsure whether association with her would weaken their own reputations. Distant relatives wrote fewer letters. Women who had admired her composure now treated it as aloofness. Even those who believed in her innocence kept their support quiet, not wishing to draw attention to themselves. A woman without visible allies became an easy target for deeper suspicion. She recognized that her name carried less weight than before. Servants hesitated before acting on her instructions, seeking confirmation from others. Courtiers no longer deferred to her in discussions. Decisions she had once made effortlessly now required negotiation or explanation. Her influence, though technically intact, functioned like a shadow, present in form but lacking substance. She lived in the same rooms yet occupied them differently. Her isolation shaped how she viewed herself. Doubt crept into her thoughts, not about her innocence, but about her ability to reclaim what she had lost. She wondered whether speaking out would worsen her situation, or whether silence would condemn her further. She realized she was being asked to defend a reputation that no longer existed in the eyes of those around her. Her dignity, so carefully maintained, felt increasingly fragile beneath the weight of others' quiet conclusions. This erosion did not destroy her immediately. It simply removed the foundation on which she had stood. Step by step, gesture by gesture, she became someone the court regarded with suspicion rather than familiarity. Her name remained, but its meaning had changed. Her standing faded through hesitation, distance, and 1,000 unspoken doubts. The retreat of those around her shaped a reputation she could no longer guide. After her name lost the certainty it once carried, observers waited to see whether she would disappear from influence entirely or cling to what little remained. The consequences of whispered strategy rarely stopped at the woman being targeted. They seeped into every corner of the household, reshaping relationships that had once felt immovable. The wife's isolation, though engineered to weaken her position, carried a deeper cost that touched the family as a whole. Those who initiated the rumors had intended only to displace her. Yet the ripple of suspicion they created unsettled the very foundations on which the household stood. What began as a quiet manipulation evolved into an atmosphere no one could fully escape. The first cracks appeared within the family itself. Trust, once assumed, began to feel conditional. The husband, already torn by doubts that others had planted, struggled to understand his own reactions. He questioned his perceptions, wondering whether he had ignored subtle signs for too long. His uncertainty made him unpredictable. Some days, he treated his wife with cautious sympathy, as though she were a misunderstood figure. On others, he viewed her through a lens shaped entirely by fear of humiliation. His inconsistency created an emotional instability that spread through the household like an unseen draft, chilling every relationship it touched. The children sensed this tension more clearly than the adults expected. They watched their father's reserved tone, their mother's quiet distress, the servants' stiffened posture, the routines that once reassured them, shared meals, warm greetings, and familiar expressions, shifted into something fragile and strained. They did not know the words surrounding their mother, but they understood the silence around her. Young as they were, they recognized the feeling of stepping into a room that no longer welcomed her. Their confusion grew into anxiety, shaping their behavior. They spoke less freely, watched more closely, and hesitated before approaching either parent. Servants, too, felt the pressure. Their roles required obedience. Yet the shifting power dynamic forced them to choose their tone, their movements, and even their loyalties with heightened care. Some feared being associated with the wife, believing that supporting her might bring consequences. Others feared the husband's unpredictability, not knowing whether he wanted comfort or distance. Their uncertainty disrupted the smooth operation of the household. Mistakes became more frequent. Delays increased. A tension settled over the daily rhythms, making every task feel heavier than before. The noble women who had participated in spreading the rumors also found themselves affected by the atmosphere they had helped create. They realized too late that the instability surrounding the wife had begun expanding outward. Conversations turned hesitant, less open, less trusting. People who had cooperated easily in the past now observed one another with quiet caution. The same mechanism that had dismantled the wife's reputation began to threaten anyone who appeared too confident, too quiet, or too connected. They understood, with a discomfort they had not anticipated, that anyone could become the next subject of speculation. At court, the atmosphere shifted from polite intrigue to pervasive unease. Whispers did not simply disappear once their target weakened. They continued seeking a new direction. Individuals who once felt secure now moderated their expressions more carefully, fearing that an unintended gesture might be misinterpreted. Visits were shortened. Conversations remained superficial. Even celebrations carried a muted tone, as though no one wanted to speak loudly enough to attract scrutiny. The court, instead of feeling victorious in its verdict, seemed to carry the burden of its own participation. The wife, positioned at the center of this transformation, felt the consequences most acutely. The emotional distance from her husband shaped every moment of her day, reminding her of how deeply mistrust had taken root. The changes in her children cut even more sharply. Their hesitations, once subtle, became visible. They approached her with cautious eyes, uncertain whether her sadness meant danger, uncertainty, or retreat. She sensed that her role as a mother had been reshaped by forces she could not control, leaving her adrift in a home that no longer felt like her own. Her attempts to restore harmony failed not because they were insincere, but because the foundation on which harmony once rested had already fractured. People interpreted her gestures according to the stories they believed. A kind word sounded strained. A calm request sounded controlling. A moment of sadness looked like guilt. She had become a figure whose intentions no longer mattered. Only her shadow did. The emotional landscape of the court changed permanently. The rumor itself had faded into background noise, overshadowed by the environment it created. Suspicion became a habit. Distance became a safeguard. Silence became the preferred form of communication. People protected themselves by withdrawing from bonds that once felt natural. It was a price no one had anticipated. Not even those who had orchestrated the whispers. They had weakened the wife. But in doing so, they had weakened the household, the family, and the court. They had created a world where trust dissolved quietly, replaced by unending vigilance. The household lost its stability as suspicion spread beyond its intended target. The fractures affecting the wife reshaped the family and the court that had judged her. Once the cost of the whispered strategy revealed itself, observers waited to see how much more the household might lose before the tension finally settled. Rumors inside the Tudor court did not need the weight of steel or the authority of parchment to determine a person's fate. They required only repetition, small enough to seem harmless, steady enough to reshape the air around their target. By the time the final whisper reached its echo, the wife's life had already shifted into a form she no longer recognized. Those who had initiated the story did not intend to create a downfall of this magnitude. They intended only to tilt the balance slightly. Yet, in a world built on perception, even a slight movement could become catastrophic. The court functioned on observation rather than proof. It believed what it felt sooner than what it could confirm. Rumors thrived in this environment because they moved without resistance. A whisper asked for no commitment, to no confrontation, no responsibility. It simply travelled. Each listener, uncertain but curious, carried it forward with a softened tone that made the story sound factual without appearing aggressive. Through these gentle exchanges, doubt became more durable than truth. The wife never heard the first whisper, only the shadow it left behind. Her days shifted into a sequence of hesitant glances, unfinished gestures, and rooms where she felt watched even when no one spoke. She sensed the withdrawal in footsteps that slowed upon approaching her, and in conversations that changed direction the moment she entered. Her world remained physically intact, but the meaning of every space within it had been rewritten by other people's imaginations. As suspicion gathered, it replaced familiarity with uncertainty. People who once shared confidences now withheld even simple observations. Those who once smiled easily at her changed their expressions into polite restraint. Her presence, which had once anchored social gatherings, now altered the tone of every room she stepped into. The court did not accuse her openly, it simply refused to include her. That refusal carried more power than any official decree. She found herself navigating corridors that felt longer than before, as though the walls had shifted to create distance she could not bridge. The isolation felt deliberate, even though no one admitted to participating in it. People claimed they were preoccupied, distracted, or overwhelmed by other matters. But their explanations did not match what she felt in their behavior. She recognized that her world was shrinking at the edges, and she could not stop the contraction. The husband, caught between uncertainty and pride, stood at the center of this quiet transformation. His sense of honor shaped every decision he made, and the whispers that reached him aligned closely with his deepest anxieties. He did not wish to see his wife as the source of instability, yet he feared appearing blind to what others claimed to witness. His internal conflict became a space where the rumors settled easily. Each time he hesitated before speaking to her, the distance widened. Each time he chose caution over trust, the story others had created strengthened itself. The marriage that once carried its own rhythm now moved according to the pressure of invisible spectators. The wife felt the change not through arguments or accusations, but through the subtle withdrawal of shared moments. A gesture that had once communicated affection now conveyed uncertainty. A shared glance no longer contained the same meaning. The silences between them stretched longer, not because of anger, but because neither could access the version of the relationship that had existed before the whispers began. The children, quiet observers of this shift, absorbed more than the adults realized. They saw their mother treated with caution and their father treated with sympathy. They sensed the asymmetry in the household's reactions and responded with confusion that shaped their daily behavior. Their questions remained unspoken, but their changed posture revealed the emotional weight they carried. They learned, without being taught, that the truth inside a household could be rewritten by the opinions of others. Even those who had participated in the rumor without malice began to feel the consequences. The atmosphere of the court changed around them. Conversations carried a faint tension, as though people feared becoming the next subject of speculation. Trust dissolved among individuals who had shared companionship for years. The rumor that had targeted the wife became a model for how easily reputations could be reshaped. And this realization unsettled those who once repeated the story freely. The mistresses who initiated the strategy found themselves in a new position. They had succeeded in weakening the wife's influence. Yet they had also created an environment where uncertainty lingered even for them. They recognized that the same mechanism that had elevated their position could be turned against them without warning. Their victory, though real, carried a quiet instability they could not fully control. Power gained through rumor offered no lasting security. The wife's reputation, once eroded, could not be rebuilt through explanation or denial. People no longer cared about the details that began the decline. They cared only about the impression that had formed. That impression, shaped by dozens of softly repeated doubts, became the version of her that the court accepted. Her attempts to reclaim herself, though sincere, appeared too late for an audience that had already formed its conclusion. Her fate was not sealed by a single act, but by the accumulation of assumptions others made in her absence. She had become a symbol rather than a person, a representation of uncertainty, misinterpretation, and vulnerability within the court's hierarchy. The rumor had succeeded not because it was true, but because it offered a narrative people found easier to believe than the complexity of her real life. The cost of this transformation extended far beyond her. The household's stability weakened, alliances shifted, and the court's atmosphere grew heavier. A single whisper, carried consistently enough, had rewritten the lives connected to her. It altered relationships, reshaped loyalty, and created fractures that would not mend easily. By the end, the wife understood that she had been undone, not through confrontation, but through quiet resignation imposed upon her by others. She had become a figure judged without defense, reshaped without permission, observed without compassion. The court believed it had acted cautiously, yet its caution had created a loss far greater than it recognized. A whisper, spoken lightly, had achieved what laws, threats, and confrontation could not. It had rewritten her world. And now, as the hallways grow quiet and the household drifts into uneasy stillness, let the weight of this tale settle gently. Thank you for walking through this dark corner of Tudor history with a steady heart. Good night. May your rest be deeper than the silences that shaped her fate.